Hello everyone, my name is Amaka and you're welcome to Lizama Stitches. So this is a continuation of our previous tutorial on how to make a circle dress with front buttons. If you've not seen that tutorial, I'm going to leave the link of that video in the description box below so that you can check it out later. So let's get started. So I've removed one. So I'm going to use one for the back panel. I'm going to be using this one for the back panel, so I'm going to cut it into two. You know the back panel has zipper allowance, so I'm cutting it into two. I've used this to cut the main fabric and the lining. Now for the back panel, I have two. Now I have two of these. This is the main fabric and this is the lining. I have two of this and two of this. Now for this one, I also have two of these. The main fabric is two and the lining is two. So now this is what I'll do. Now this is the back panel. Now I'm going to close this zipper. I'm closing the zipper allowance because of the collar. You know, the reason why I added the zipper allowance, why I wanted to use zipper for the back panel, is because of the two side pockets. I didn't want to add zipper by the side of the dress, but because of the collar, the style of collar, I'm not going to use back zipper. I'm not going to use zipper for the back panel. I'm going to close this. So I'm going to close the zipper allowance. I'll take this to my sewing machine and I'm going to sew it this way. I'll close the zipper allowance. Now the same thing I'm going to do here, I'm also going to do on the lining. I'll do on the lining. I'm also going to close the lining zipper allowance. So after closing the lining zipper allowance, I'll close the lining zipper allowance. After that, I'm going to sew here with 1/2 inch seam allowance. And I'll sew here with 1/2 inch seam allowance. I'll join the side with 1/2 inch seam allowance. So that's it with the back for now. Now this is the front panel. Now this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to bring the lining. I'll place the lining just like this. And I'll sew. I'm going to sew the sides. I'm going to sew the side with 1/2 inch seam allowance. And I'll sew here with 1/2 inch seam allowance. Then I'll sew the button opening. This part I'm going to sew here with 1/2 inch seam allowance. I'll sew here and I'll sew to this point with 1/2 inch seam allowance. The same thing, I'm going to sew here and sew to this point with 1/2 inch seam allowance. So I'm going to do it and show you the outcome. So now this is the back panel. I've joined the back panel. I've joined the sides. I've closed the sides and I also closed the zipper allowance. I did the same thing on the main fabric. Now the neckline is open, the shoulder is open. Now for the front panel, this is what I did. I joined the side. I have to sew the side with 1/2 inch seam allowance. Then the button allowance, I also sewed with 1/2 inch seam allowance. Now what I have left here is the button allowance, is the button overlap. Take note, I've also closed my dart. I've closed the dart of the front panel and the back panel. Now the next thing I'm going to do, the shoulder is still open, the neckline is still open. So now the next, now let me show you how to join the front panel to the back panel. Now this is the front panel. Now this is how to join the shoulders. Now this is the main fabric of the front panel and this is the main fabric of the back panel. Now I'm going to bring the two together and join it together. Now this is what I'm doing. I'm going to join it right side facing right side. I'll join it this way, right side facing right side, and I'll sew it with 1/2 inch seam allowance. Now after sewing with 1/2 inch seam allowance, I'm going to hold the lining. I'm going to join the lining this way, right side facing right side, and I'm going to sew. Now this is the right side of the lining, right side facing right side, and I'm going to sew it. I'll sew with 1/2 inch seam allowance. Now the same way I'm going to join this, that's how I'm going to do to this one too. And the same thing I'll do to this one. Now after that I'll join the sides. After that I'll join the sides. Now this is how I'm going to join the side. After joining the shoulder, I'll sew the sides. I'll place it right side facing right side and I'll sew with 1 inch seam allowance. I have 1 inch seam allowance left. I'll sew with 1 inch seam allowance, and for this one I'll also sew with 1 inch seam allowance. So I'm going to do it and show you the next thing to do. Now after sewing, this is what I have. Now I've sewn the sides. I had to sew from here and I stopped here. I left this allowance where I'm going to join the lower part. Now there's allowance here, I didn't sew to this point. The same thing with this part, I didn't sew to this point. I've joined the shoulders. Now see the shoulder, you see inside, you're not seeing the seam. The seam allowance is inside. You see? The same thing with this one. The seam allowance is inside. So the only place that is open now is the neckline. So I'm going to measure from this part. I'll measure from this point round to this point. So what I have here is 26 inches. I have 26 inches. So I'm going to add 1 inch seam allowance to it, making it 27 inches. So what I'm working with is 27 inches. Now I'm going to divide this 27 inches by 2. When I divide my 27 inches by 2, I have 13.5 inches. So on the collar, so what I'm going to measure out is 13.5 inches. Now this is the fabric I'll be using for the collar. Now this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to pick this part and I'll fold it on bias, just like this. And I'll pick this part just like this. So from here, I'm going to measure the height of the collar, which is 6 inches. Now the height of the collar is 6 inches. So from here, I'm going to measure the length of the collar, which is 13.5 inches. So this is 13.5 inches. This is at 13.5 inches. So from this point, I'm going to connect it to this point. Just like this. And I'll cut it. So this is the collar. Now take note, I took my measurement from this folded edge. This is my collar. I've ironed my collar. I've ironed interfacing to the collar, and I also ironed it down. So the next thing I'm going to do, the next thing I'm going to do, I'm going to take this to my sewing machine and I'm going to sew this part. I'll sew here with half inch seam allowance. I'll sew it right side facing right side with half inch seam allowance. I'll sew it and I'll stop here. And I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to do the same thing here. I'll sew from here. And I'll stop here. Then I'll turn it to the right side, and now I'm going to show you how to attach it to the dress. After sewing here, you find the midpoint of the collar. Now this is the midpoint of the collar. I'm going to notch it. Now this is the midpoint of the collar. I've notched it. So now I'll show you how to attach it to your dress. So this is what I'm going to do. Now this is the midpoint of my collar. This is the midpoint of my collar, and this is the midpoint of the upper part of my dress. So I'm going to fix this collar. Now I'm going to turn this collar to the I'll sew it from inside. Now this is the wrong side. So I'll hold here. Now this is the main fabric. This is my collar. And this is the lining. This is the midpoint of the lining. So I'm going to join the three together. Now take note, the collar is in between. The collar is in between the main fabric and the lining. So I'm going to join it together and I'll sew. I'm sewing from the wrong side. So I'll sew it. I'm going to sew it this way. I'll sew it to this point. I'll sew it and I'll stop here. I'll sew it and I'll stop here. And I'm going to do the same thing on this part. I'll sew from here and I'll stop. I'll stop here. I'll stop here. So I'm going to sew it this way. I'll hold the collar and the main fabric and the lining, and I'll sew it together. And I'll stop here. So when I finish sewing, I'm going to turn it to the right side. So I'm going to do it and show you the outcome. After sewing, this is what I have. You see how I sewed it from inside? I sewed it round. I held the midpoint and I sewed to this side and I sewed to this side. Now let me turn it to the right side so that you'll see what I have. Now the importance of this is that the seam allowance will be inside and you have a neat finishing, very neat finishing. So this is it. You see how it is? This is the wrong side of my dress and this is the right side. You see how it is? It's very neat. So now I'm going to show you how to attach the lower part. So this is it. If you want the neck to be as wide as the one on the thumbnail. Now, what I did here, on the neckline, I used 3 inches neck width and 7 inches neck depth. That is for the front panel. For the back panel, I used 1 inch neck depth and 3 inches neck width. But if you want yours to be as wide as the one on the thumbnail, if you want your neckline to be as wide as the one on the thumbnail, you can use 4 inches neck width and maybe 7 inches or 8 inches neck depth. So it all depends on how you want to do it. That is for the front panel. For the back, you can still use 4 inches neck width and maybe 1.5 inches neck depth. So that's just it with this. So this is it. So now I'm going to show you how to attach the lower part to the upper part. Now after fixing the collar, now the next thing I'm going to do is this. Now I'm going to sew here. Now this opening, the button opening, I'm going to sew this part. Now let me hold it with my pin. I'm going to take this to my sewing machine and I'm going to sew it. Just this part, just the button allowance. I'm just going to place one part on this part and sew it. Now when I sew it, I'm going to bring the lower part. Now this is the lower. Now this is the lower part. I'm going to find the midpoint of this. I'll find the midpoint. Now this is the midpoint, and I'll place it on the midpoint of the upper part, just like this, and I'll sew. I'll sew with 1/2 inch seam allowance. I'll sew to this point. I'll sew it to this edge. You remember that I left this part, and this part is still open. So I'll sew it to this part. This part is still open to an extent. So I'm going to sew it to this part, and I'll sew here. From here, I'll sew to this part. I'll sew from here to here. Now for the back panel, so that is it with the front panel. Now for the back panel, the same way I closed the zipper allowance of the upper part, I also closed the zipper allowance of the lower part. Now this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to hold, this is the midpoint. This is the midpoint. I'm going to hold this midpoint and I'm going to hold this part. That is the zipper allowance. I'll hold it and I'll hold this, the one of the upper part, and I'll sew. I'm going to sew it to this point. I'm going to sew to this point with 1/2 inch seam allowance, and I'll do the same thing from here to here. I'll sew. I'm going to sew it to this point with 1/2 inch seam allowance. So after sewing, I'm going to fix the zipper on one side, on the left hand side. Then I'll show you how to fix the pocket. Now I'm going to cut the pocket. So I'm going to use it to make only one pocket. So I'm just going to place my hand this way, and I'll I'll sketch. Now there are no rules to this. Just place your hand and just draft it. That's just it. So what I have here is 8 inches and it's just okay for me. So I'll cut it. So I have two of these. I have two of these. Now I'm going to show you how to attach it to your dress. Now this is my dress. Now I've fixed the sleeve. I've fixed the sleeve. So this is just a basic sleeve. I have a tutorial on how to draft a basic sleeve. I'm going to leave the link of that video in the description box below so that you can check it out later. Now for this side, I've also attached the zipper. Now I used an invisible zipper. So I've fixed the zipper. And now I'm going to, because my fabric is not enough, I'm going to attach the pocket on one side. On one side. So now what I'm going to do from the waist point, I'm going to come down by 2 inches and I'll mark. So this is my 2 inches point and this is 2 inches. So now this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to bring one of the pockets. Now I'm going to place this on this right side facing right side. I'll take this to my sewing machine and I will sew. I'll sew with half inch seam allowance. Now let me illustrate with pins. So now after sewing, I'm going to turn it this way. Now I placed it right side facing right side. So I'm going to turn it this way and I'll top stitch. Now the same thing I'm also going to do on this part. Let me just show you everything I'm going to do. Then I'll take it to my sewing machine and I'll do it. So I'm going to place it this way, right side facing right side, and I'll sew with half inch seam allowance. So I'm going to sew. Now I'm going to sew it with half inch seam allowance. Now after sewing, I'm going to turn it this way and I'll top stitch. I'll push the seam allowance. Now after that, I'm going to push the seam allowance on the pocket and I'll top stitch. Now the same thing I'm going to do on this. I'll push after sewing with half inch seam allowance. I'll push the seam allowance on the pocket and I'll top stitch. I'll top stitch. So after that, I'm going to turn it to the wrong side and I'll sew. So I'll turn it to the wrong side and I'm going to sew it this way. Now this is how I'm going to sew it. I'm going to sew it with 1 inch seam allowance. I'm going to sew it with 1 inch seam allowance. I'll sew. Now I have the 2 pockets here. I'll join them together and I'll sew with 1 inch seam allowance. I'll sew to this point and I'll sew it down. So after that, I'm going to hem the lower part. I'll fix the buttons and I'll wear it on my mannequin and show you what it looks like. If you found this tutorial helpful, please click on the like button. Share this video with your friends. Share this video in your sewing groups. Subscribe to my channel if you've not done so. Feel free to ask questions. I'll be in the comment section to answer all your questions. We've come to the end of this tutorial. Thanks for watching. See you in my next video. Bye.